My name is Samuel Smith, and before sickness stripped the noise from my life and revealed the truth about my own flesh and blood, I was a man defined by discipline, patience, and long-term thinking. I am 62 years old as I tell this story, though I feel much older in my bones. For most of my adult life, I worked quietly as a procurement consultant in the energy and logistics sector, the kind of man companies called only when they needed problems solved discreetly. I wore simple clothes, drove modest cars, and spoke little about myself, which led many people, including my own son, to believe I lived an unremarkable, financially fragile life. If you love ruthless revenge stories packed with shocking twists, like this video and subscribe now. New, never-before-seen stories are released here every day, each more intense than the last. I was raised to believe that wealth should whisper, not shout, and that principle guided every decision I made. After decades of consulting contracts across borders, I transitioned into what I told everyone was early retirement. Though in truth, I still managed several private investments and trusts. I lived alone in a small, clean house, cooked my own meals, and attended church regularly, never missing a Sunday unless work demanded otherwise. People saw an aging widower with thinning hair and assumed my best years were behind me. I let them believe that because it was safer that way, and because revealing too much too soon often invites the wrong kind of love. My son, Aaron, was my only child, and I raised him with care after his mother passed away unexpectedly when he was still young. I worked long hours, yes, but every sacrifice I made was for him. I paid for his schooling, his overseas degree, his first business venture that failed quietly, and even the second one that nearly buried him in debt. I never complained, never reminded him of what I'd done, because I believed a father's love was not a ledger. Over time, though, I noticed how his visits grew shorter and his calls more transactional, as though I were no longer family but an obligation. The sickness came suddenly, without drama or warning. One morning, I collapsed in my kitchen, my right side numb and my vision blurred. The doctors called a mild stroke, survivable but life-altering, requiring monitoring, medication, and rest. When I called Aaron from the hospital, my voice shaking more from disappointment than fear, I expected concern, maybe even urgency. Instead, there was a pause on the line, followed by a sigh that told me everything before he spoke. He asked about hospital bills, insurance coverage, and whether I expected him to handle anything, as though my illness were an inconvenience interrupting his schedule. What followed over the next weeks still plays in my mind like a slow, deliberate betrayal. Aaron stopped visiting altogether, citing work pressure and travel. When I finally asked him directly if I could stay with him temporarily while I recovered, he laughed lightly, then hardened his tone. He told me I had made poor life choices, that he couldn't become my caretaker, and that I should make arrangements. Those words, spoken without anger but full of distance, cut deeper than the stroke ever did. In that moment, I realized my value to him had always been conditional, measured only by what I could still provide. The day he disowned me did not come with shouting or slammed doors. It came quietly, through a carefully worded message explaining that he needed to focus on his own family and future, and that my health issues were too much emotional pressure. He suggested I consider assisted living and wished me strength. That was the last message he sent, and when I tried calling back, my number was blocked. I sat alone in my living room, medication lying neatly on the table, and felt something inside me harden into resolve. Grief had turned into clarity, and clarity into something far more dangerous. What Aaron never knew, what no one knew, was that during all those years of quiet work, I had built something substantial: offshore investments, commercial properties held under corporate entities, and a family trust established long before my stroke, all carefully structured and legally airtight. I had done this not out of greed, but out of prudence, intending one day to pass it all on to my son when he was mature enough to understand responsibility. Ironically, it was his abandonment that finally showed me who he truly was, and who he would never become. As I recovered, slowly regaining strength and balance, I began reviewing documents I had not touched in years. trust clauses, beneficiary conditions, succession instructions, all written by a younger version of me who believed blood guaranteed loyalty. I realized then that sickness had not ruined my life. It had revealed it. My son thought I was weak, disposable, and broke. He thought wrong. And while I never planned revenge in a dramatic sense, I did plan justice, cold, precise, and irreversible, because some lessons are too expensive to be taught gently. Recovery is a strange season of life, one that forces a man to sit still long enough to hear his own thoughts without distraction. As my body slowly healed, my mind sharpened with an intensity one had not felt in years. Each morning, I woke before dawn, took my medication with measured care, and walked the length of my living room until my legs remembered their purpose. But it was during those silent hours that I replayed every memory of raising Aaron, every sacrifice I had labeled as just part of fatherhood, and every warning sign I had ignored because love had blinded me. I realized then that I was not mourning my son's absence alone. I was mourning the illusion of who I thought he was. The more I reflected, the more I understood that Aaron had not changed overnight. His cruelty during my illness was not spontaneous. It was simply unmasked. I remembered moments I had once brushed aside, how he mocked my modest lifestyle, how he avoided conversations about integrity, how he measured success only by what could be seen and envied. I remembered the subtle impatience in his voice whenever I spoke about values instead of money. All those moments came rushing back with painful clarity, forming a pattern I could no longer deny. He had loved what he thought I could give, not who I was, and when he believed I had nothing left, he discarded me without hesitation. During this time, I reached out to no one for sympathy. Pride may be a flaw, but dignity is not, and I refused to beg for emotional scraps from people who had already shown their limits. Instead, I focused inward and forward. I contacted my longtime attorney, a man who had known me for over 25 years and understood my preference for discretion. We spoke at length, reviewing documents I had drafted long before my illness, documents designed to protect assets but now destined to redefine legacy. For the first time, I asked him not what was possible, but what was irreversible, because I had learned that some doors, once closed, should never be reopened. As weeks passed, my strength returned enough for me to resume limited oversight of my investments. From my study, surrounded by ledgers and digital dashboards, I reconnected with partners who respected me not because of appearances, but because of results. They spoke to me with the same confidence and deference as before, unaware that my own son had written me off as a burden. It was in those conversations that my resolve solidified. I was not the helpless old man Aaron believed me to be. I was still sharp, still relevant, and still very much in control of a fortune he had never imagined existed. I began to understand that revenge does not always require confrontation or cruelty. Sometimes the most devastating consequence is absence, the removal of opportunity, access, and expectation. I did not want Aaron to suffer physically or publicly. I wanted him to face the quiet terror of realizing that the future he assumed was guaranteed had evaporated because of his own choices. That kind of reckoning lingers longer than anger. It forces reflection, and reflection is often far more painful than punishment. I resolved that if he ever learned the truth, it would be too late to benefit from it. There were moments, late at night, when doubt crept in. I questioned whether a father should ever close the door entirely on his child, no matter the offense. But then I would remember the hospital room, the cold tone of his voice, the message that disowned me while I was still learning how to walk properly again. Forgiveness, I learned, requires remorse, and remorse requires awareness. Aaron had shown neither. What he had shown was calculation, and I decided that if he understood numbers so well, then numbers would be the language of his lesson. By the end of my recovery period, I was no longer the man who had collapsed on a kitchen floor weeks earlier. I stood straighter, thought clearer, and felt something close to peace. Not the peace of reconciliation, but the peace of certainty. I knew exactly what I was going to do, and more importantly, I knew when to do it. My son believed my story had ended with sickness and isolation. In truth, It was only entering its most deliberate chapter, one written with patience, foresight, and a silence that would one day speak louder than any confrontation ever could. Once my body steadied and my mind regained its rhythm, I turned my attention to something I had neglected for too long: control. Not control over people, but control over outcomes. Illness teaches a man that nothing is permanent except preparation, and I had always been a planner by nature. I began organizing my days with precision, dividing my time between health reflection and strategic review. I stopped waiting for pain to remind me I was alive and started acting like a man who had survived for a reason. Every document I revisited, every account I reviewed, reminded me that my life's work was not fragile, no matter how fragile my body had briefly become. I spent long afternoons in my study, surrounded by files that told a story my son had never cared to hear. These were records of decades spent building quietly: minority stakes in shipping firms, equity positions in regional energy suppliers, long-term bonds secured through foreign trusts. None of it flashy, none of it impulsive. I had never chased attention or applause, only stability and growth. As I reviewed these holdings, I felt a deep, unsettling calm. Aaron had dismissed me as irrelevant. Yet here I was, managing more capital from a small wooden desk than he had ever controlled in his loudest, most ambitious years. During this period, I also revised my will for the first time since my wife passed away. That document had once been simple, almost naive, written with the assumption that family bonds were unbreakable. Now, I read it like a stranger would, identifying weaknesses and assumptions that no longer applied. I added clauses, conditions, and contingencies that reflected not anger, but realism. I did not remove my son entirely, not yet, but I made his position depend on character, not blood. If he ever wished to benefit from my life's work, he would first need to demonstrate humanity, something he had proven shockingly short of. What surprised me most during this chapter of my life was how little resentment I actually felt. There was sadness, yes, and disappointment deeper than words, but resentment requires emotional attachment, and that attachment had already been severed by Aaron's own hand. I was no longer reacting to his behavior. I was responding to reality. That distinction mattered. Revenge driven by rage is sloppy and short-lived. What I was building required patience, neutrality, and a discipline to wait until consequences unfolded naturally. I was not plotting harm. I was withdrawing privilege. As my strength continued to improve, I began attending small social gatherings again: church meetings, professional luncheons, quiet dinners with former colleagues. I did not speak of my illness unless asked, and even then I minimized it. People saw me as resilient, perhaps a little thinner, but still sharp. None of them knew I had been abandoned by my own son, and none of them needed to know. I learned that dignity thrives in silence, and that oversharing often weakens resolve. While Aaron erased me from his life, I was reestablishing my place in a world that valued substance over convenience. Occasionally, I heard fragments of my son's life through distant connections. His business ventures were unstable, his spending habits reckless, his confidence inflated beyond his actual success. He spoke publicly about self-made progress, about independence, about never needing help. Each time I heard such things, I felt neither pride nor anger, only confirmation. He was performing strength, mistaking noise for power, while relying on assumptions that no longer held true. He believed that even if everything collapsed, there would always be a safety net waiting quietly in the background. That belief was his greatest weakness. One evening, as I sat alone reviewing correspondence from my attorney, it occurred to me that Aaron's greatest punishment would not be revelation, but ignorance. If he knew what he had lost, he might attempt remorse. If he believed nothing existed, he would continue as he was, careless, entitled, unprepared. I instructed my attorney to maintain strict confidentiality, ensuring that no hint of my financial position ever reached him. Let the illusion stand. Let him believe he had severed ties with a man of no consequence. Time, after all, has a way of amplifying truth without announcing it. By the end of that season, I felt grounded in a way I never had before. I was no longer defined by fatherhood alone, nor by sacrifice misunderstood. I was defined by clarity. I had survived sickness, abandonment, and disappointment, and emerged not bitter, but precise. My son thought he had closed the door on me, but in reality he had only revealed which doors I needed to close myself. And as I moved forward, step by deliberate step, I knew the foundation had been laid for a reckoning that would arrive not with drama, but with devastating finality. There's a certain advantage that comes with age that you've never truly understands, and that advantage is patience sharpened by experience. As months passed and my health stabilized, I began to appreciate time not as something slipping away, but as a tool bending quietly in my favor. I no longer rushed decisions or felt compelled to explain myself to anyone. Each day followed a steady rhythm. Morning walks, measured meals, careful monitoring of my health, and then hours dedicated to oversight of my affairs. While my son believed I was declining into obscurity, I was in fact becoming more intentional than I had ever been in my life. I slowly reinserted myself into professional circles, not visibly, but strategically. I resumed advisory roles under consulting agreements that carried no public titles and attracted no attention. Companies still valued my insight, especially during uncertain times, and I found that my judgment, refined by hardship, was sharper than before. I worked fewer hours, but every hour mattered. This quiet relevance strengthened my position and reminded me that worth is not measured by who acknowledges you, but by who still depends on your wisdom without realizing it. During this period, I also began restructuring several long-term holdings, consolidating assets, and simplifying access in ways that would make future decisions cleaner and irreversible. I moved slowly, deliberately, ensuring everything remained legal, ethical, and airtight. I did not want chaos or conflict after my time was done. I wanted clarity. My attorney and financial advisors noted the precision of my instructions, and though they asked few questions, I could tell they understood something fundamental had changed. I was no longer planning as a father hopeful for reconciliation. I was planning as a man protecting the truth of his life. What weighed on me most during these months was not anger, but reflection. I replayed moments from Aaron's childhood, moments when he had laughed freely, trusted me completely, and believed without question that I would always be there. Somewhere along the way, expectation had replaced gratitude, and entitlement had replaced love. I accepted my role in that transformation, acknowledging that shielding him from consequences may have prepared him poorly for reality. That understanding did not excuse his abandonment, but it did sharpen my resolve to let consequences finally do their work. Ironically, as I withdrew emotionally from my son, others stepped closer. Former colleagues checked in, neighbors offered help without obligation, and members of my church community showed kindness without calculation. None of them knew the full story, and none of them needed to. Their presence reminded me that family is not defined solely by blood, but by consistency and care. It was a lesson I wished Aaron had learned earlier, because by the time he realized it, the cost would be far higher than he imagined. I heard through indirect channels that Aaron's life was becoming more strained. His business ventures struggled to gain traction, partnerships dissolved, and financial pressure mounted. He told people he had cut ties with me by choice, framing it as independence rather than abandonment. I allowed that narrative to stand. Correcting it would have served no purpose. The truth did not need offense. It only needed time. And time, I had learned, is relentless when left undisturbed. There were moments when I wondered if he would reach out, not to apologize, but to test whether the bridge was truly burned. Each time my phone rang unexpectedly, I felt a flicker of recognition quickly replaced by calm. I had already decided that access to me was no longer unconditional. If he ever returned, it would not be as a beneficiary or a dependent, but as a man prepared to face the consequences of his choices. Until then, silence was not cruelty, it was protection. By the end of that year, I felt stronger than I had before my illness, not physically perhaps, but in spirit and purpose. I no longer feared loneliness or obscurity. I had learned that being underestimated can be a form of freedom, and being forgotten can be an advantage. My son believed the chapter of my relevance had closed. In reality, I was only allowing the final act to take shape naturally, knowing that when the truth eventually surfaced, it would do so without my intervention and without mercy. There's a moment in every long plan when silence becomes heavier than action, And that is when you know the design is almost complete. By the second year after my illness, my life had settled into something deceptively simple. I appeared to the outside world as a retired widower living quietly, managing his health, attending church, and keeping to himself. What no one saw was that every loose end had been tied, every assumption tested, and every safeguard reinforced. I was no longer reacting to circumstances. I was waiting for timing, because timing, more than money or power, decides the weight of consequences. My days were calm, but not empty. I continued advisory work under layers of confidentiality, offering insight to firms that valued results more than appearances. I no longer chased growth aggressively. Instead, I preserved and positioned what already existed. Each decision was made with the understanding that legacy is not about how much you leave behind, but how deliberately you leave it. I reviewed beneficiary structures again and again, ensuring there was no ambiguity, no room for emotional manipulation, and no chance that obligation could be mistaken for entitlement. Everything was written clearly, unemotionally, and beyond dispute. What struck me most during this phase was how completely Aaron had erased me from his narrative. Through distant acquaintances, I learned that he spoke of me as though I were already gone, referring to me in the past tense, framing his life as a story of self-reliance forged through hardship. He told people his father had been weak, unprepared, and dependent, and that cutting ties had been necessary for his own survival. Hearing this did not anger me. Instead, it confirmed something essential. He had built his identity on a lie, and lies collapse under their own weight when reality finally intervenes. I had long since stopped hoping for reconciliation, but I still observed from a distance, not out of attachment, but out of responsibility. A man should know the full scope of what he is leaving behind. Aaron's finances were unstable, stretched thin by ambition, unsupported by discipline. He chased appearances, leasing offices he could not afford, entertaining clients he could not sustain, and projecting confidence that masked growing desperation. He believed success was just one breakthrough away, never realizing that his greatest safety net had already been removed by his own hand. One afternoon, as I reviewed correspondence from my attorney, I felt something settle inside me that I can only describe as finality. The last amendments had been executed, witnesses secured, and legal confirmations received. There was nothing left to adjust, nothing left to reconsider. I sat back in my chair and realized that for the first time since my son disowned me, I felt completely free. Free from expectation, free from disappointment, and free from the illusion that love alone could substitute for character. I had done what needed to be done, not as punishment, but as truth. That night, I slept deeply without dreams or regrets. I understood then that revenge, in its most effective form, does not require confrontation or spectacle. It requires restraint. It requires allowing someone to live fully inside the consequences of their choices, without interruption or rescue. Aaron had chosen distance, dismissal, and disregard. I had simply honored that choice permanently. There was no cruelty in that, only consistency. If he had wanted a different outcome, he would have needed to choose differently when it mattered most. As weeks passed, subtle shifts began to ripple through his world. Investors grew cautious. Credit tightened. Opportunities evaporated without explanation. Doors he expected to open remained firmly closed. He blamed timing, market conditions, even betrayal by others, never once considering that the foundation he stood on had been built on assumptions rather than reality. I watched none of this directly, but the echoes reached me nonetheless, carried by conversations I never initiated and news I never sought. Each echo told the same story. Pressure was mounting, and the margin for error was gone. By the end of that season, I understood that the illusion of finality is often the most dangerous phase, because it convinces people they have survived the worst when in truth they have only reached a point of no return. Aaron believed my absence meant insignificance, that my silence meant surrender. He had no idea that the quiet he dismissed was the very thing shaping his future. And as I prepared myself for whatever time I had left, I knew with certainty that when the truth finally revealed itself, it would not come from me. It would come from the realization that the safety he counted on had never truly existed, and never would. The truth has a way of surfacing when man is least prepared to face it, and by the time it reached my son, it arrived without warning or mercy. I learned later, through my attorney, that Aaron had finally begun asking questions, not about me as a father, but about me as a man. His financial pressures had reached a breaking point, and in his desperation, he searched for any remaining support he assumed might exist. He contacted distant relatives, former associates, even old friends of mine, trying to piece together a narrative that could rescue him. What he found instead was silence, confusion, and fragments of reality he had never imagined. When the first undeniable confirmation emerged that I was not and never had been the broken old man he dismissed, it shook him deeply. He discovered corporate records, advisory acknowledgments, and financial structures that contradicted everything he had told himself. The man he had disowned was not weak or destitute, but quietly formidable. I am told his reaction was not remorse, but disbelief, followed by anger. He felt deceived, as though my privacy had been a personal betrayal, never once considering that his abandonment had forfeited his right to know anything about my life. Eventually, he attempted to reach me. The call came through my attorney, not directly, framed as concern and curiosity rather than apology. He wanted to talk, to clear the air, to reconnect. Those words, so casually chosen, carried no accountability. I declined without hesitation. I did not owe him closure, explanations, or comfort. Closure is something you earn through honesty, not something you demand after consequences arrive. I instructed my attorney to communicate only what was legally necessary and nothing more. My silence was no longer passive. It was intentional. What Aaron struggled to accept was that the story had already ended long before he realized it was still being written. He had mistaken my illness for an ending, my silence for surrender, and my simplicity for insignificance. He had never understood that restraint is often mistaken for weakness by those who confuse noise with power. The truth was never hidden from him. It was simply irrelevant to a man who valued people only for what they could immediately provide. By the time he wanted to know more, there was nothing left for him to receive. As my health stabilized and my days grew quieter, I reflected often on legacy. Not money, not property, but meaning. I had once believed my greatest legacy would be my son. That belief had been replaced by something more honest. Legacy, I learned, is not guaranteed by blood, but by values carried forward. I redirected portions of my estate toward causes aligned with discipline, education, and integrity, places where effort was met with opportunity and gratitude, not expectation. It felt right, not as punishment, but as alignment. I do not hate my son. Hate requires emotional investment, and that investment was exhausted the day he disowned me when I was sick and vulnerable. What I feel now is distance, clear, measured, and permanent. I wish him no harm, but I offer no rescue. Life will teach him what I can no longer afford to. Some lessons must be learned without a safety net, because only then do they truly settle into the bones. If he ever understands that, it will be because pain forced reflection, not because forgiveness softened consequence. In my quieter moments, I sometimes imagine what might have been different had he chosen compassion over convenience. But imagination is a luxury for those still undecided. I made my peace with reality, and that peace did not require reconciliation. I wake each day knowing I acted with clarity, fairness, and restraint. I did not seek revenge through destruction, but through truth. I allowed a man to live exactly the life he chose, without interference, correction, or inheritance. This is not a story about wealth revealed or power reclaimed. It is a story about choice and consequence. My son disowned me when I was sick, believing I had nothing left to offer. He was right in one sense. I had nothing left for him. What I did have, however, was everything he assumed would one day be his. And by the time he learned the truth, the lesson was complete, irreversible, and deserved. If you enjoyed this story, hit the like button and leave a comment letting me know what you thought. And if you're not already subscribed, please subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss new stories like this one. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.